L'honorable député de Sturgeon River, Parkland.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to rise again and speak on this bill C-35. I want to start by addressing some of the amendments that were put forward by the other place. In the initial part of this bill, there was no reference to official language minority communities, and it was actually conservative amendments made during the clause-by-clause phase review at the HUMA Committee that introduced these safeguards for our very important minority language communities. We know that early childcare is a crucial period for language learning and the identity development of children. And access to French language early childhood care services is so necessary as a condition for the transmission of languages that have been transmitted by families over generations. Now, several examples demonstrate the necessity of including these provisions in the bill. In Alberta, out of the so-called 1,500 new daycare spaces that were announced by the government, only 19 were being allocated for francophones, and that constitutes only 0.013% of all spaces, despite francophones representing 2% of the population of Alberta. The importance of protecting these communities and their part in Canadian heritage who helped build this nation, whether they be francophones in Alberta or anglophones in Quebec. I want to talk about the great francophone heritage of my community. We had a gentleman, Ben Van de Waal, who's the son of the late great member of parliament from my area, Walter Van de Waal, who represented the great francophone communities of Morinville, Rivière-Quebar, and Legal. We have a very strong francophone identity in Sturgeon River Parkland, and these conservative amendments put forward will go a long way to preserving our French language heritage in our region. Now that I've addressed these amendments, I want to talk about what I see as the unraveling disaster that we're seeing because of this Liberal government's failed approach to childcare. The proposed legislation and the current agreements made by the government with the provinces are failing to provide universal access to affordable childcare and will cost far more than the government has estimated. Small businesses are the backbone of our society, and the predominantly female entrepreneurs who are courageously trying to build a business and build their livelihoods through providing childcare are under attack by this Liberal government. The excessive red tape and regulation of this Liberal government is preventing daycare entrepreneurs from opening new spaces and expanding their businesses. They can't get the funding because the government won't fund new spaces. And this is making childcare less accessible. And it's all because of this Liberal government imposing a one-size-fits-all model on a very complex sector of our economy. In the words of some childcare operators, this Liberal government is essentially expropriating and nationalizing their businesses. In the words of one operator from Fort McMurray, basically, I will have no business under this Liberal plan. Now, one of the government's tired talking points is their insistence that they have evidence-based policies. Now, a more appropriate term would be evidence that is selective, that corresponds with their ideological agenda. Let's go over some of the facts. As of the stats published on the 6th of February, just a short time ago, 77% of low-income parents have access, 77% of high-income parents have access to childcare. And this compares to only 41% of low-income parents who have access to childcare. It's a yawning gap. And I find it somewhat comedic that a Bloc MP earlier was talking about how great this program is for single mothers. Well, the University of British Columbia actually did a study in that province where they contacted all the childcare centers to find out how many single mothers, how many low-income single mothers were benefiting from this program. You know how many they found across the entire province of British Columbia who were benefiting? 17. 17 single mothers were all that were benefiting in the province of British Columbia from these Liberals' failed daycare policy. Now, since 2019, the number of children under the age of 5 in childcare has fallen under this government by 118,000 spaces. This is a decrease of 8.5% nationally. Now, 46.4% of parents reported difficulty in finding childcare in 2023. Which is up from 36.4% of parents in 2019. This is a problem that existed before this government's policy, but it's a problem that's only getting worse under this government's failed policy. In fact, I personally know people who can only get one of their 2 children in childcare, and they have to stay at home to take care of the other children. These people are nurses and they're other skilled workers who can't pursue their career because this government has made it more difficult for them to access any childcare. It doesn't matter if it says it's affordable. If I could get 50-cent gas at the gas station, that'd be great, but if there was never any gas at the gas station, it wouldn't matter how affordable the price was. Now, why is childcare so expensive? Well, we know that the key costs for childcare, according to the operators, in order of magnitude, are labor costs, the cost of the facilities, and the cost of food and other supplies. Childcare is a labor-intensive operation, and the cost to create a space that is appropriate for children and the accompanying mortgage rental costs, insurance costs, and maintenance costs are extremely significant. And finally, the cost of food and other supplies has increased dramatically under this inflationary government. Now, what is a factor in all three of these costs, you might ask? Well, it's high inflation, Mr. Speaker. High inflation has increased the cost of labor, it's increased the cost of rentals, it's increased the cost of mortgage insurance, and it's increased the cost of food at the local grocery store. The price of food has gone up by 12%. And childcare operators are not immune from these costs. They don't get some special discount at the store because they're childhood care operators. And the fact is that this government, through its inflationary policies, are driving up the cost to care for children in Canada. And at the same time that they're driving up all of these costs, they're shortchanging childcare operators by only giving them a 3% annual increase in their funding. They cannot support children when food prices are going up 12%, when wage costs are going up, when mortgage costs are doubling and tripling, and rental costs are tripling. They cannot support these children with only a 3% increase from this government. This government is expecting these predominantly female business owners to eat these costs, and consequently, it's causing them to shut down their business, to reduce spaces, and restrict access to childcare for Canadians. In the childcare sector in Alberta, we're already seeing the consequences of this inflationary agenda. Last month, parents in my ridings were unable to get childcare because of closures in protest to these Liberal policies. And operators have described these agreements as underfunded, inflexible, and that they threaten the financial viability of operators by placing fee caps and other restrictions on facilities that are struggling with these increased costs. The owner of My Happy Place Daycare in Stony Plain said, quote, "Right now we are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Just being closed for the day has a huge impact. Imagine what would happen if daycare centers across the province started closing their doors because they're going bankrupt. And I fear that because of these Liberals' ideological approach to childcare, that is a future that we're seeing coming very quickly." Now, the proposed solution for inflation by proponents of even more government intervention in early childcare is no surprise, more inflationary spending. This government has tried to raise the wages of childcare workers, but this is putting us into a wage spiral because other groups who are competing for childcare workers, such as school boards, are also raising their wages in order to compete for these workers. In one case, I spoke to a mother who worked in childcare previously before this government's policies were in place. She worked in it because she received a significant discount to provide her own childcare at that facility. Once this government brought in its policies, her daycare operator got rid of the discount. It wasn't necessary anymore, and so she lost her incentive to work in childcare. She's left that sector. Now there's one less childcare worker in that sector. I've spoken with childcare operators who've had to pay increased rents and mortgages on their facility, and everyone knows that these mortgages and rental rates are skyrocketing after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, particularly in the last year. And under agreements that this government signed, childcare operators are limited in the costs that they can bill the government towards their rent and mortgages. And since they are mandated to only charge families a fixed price, there is no way these operators can make up the difference other than by reducing other costs. And what are these costs that you might ask? Food, crafts. We really want to talk about reducing the quality of the food and the quality of the programming for our children just so these daycare operators can make up the costs of skyrocketing mortgages and rents because this government won't support them. You know, what's actually now happening is that they're just choosing to shut down instead. They don't want to provide subpar care for their children under these Liberals' policies, so they're just shutting down altogether. It's terrible to see. The laws of supply and demand mean that the government must either restrict the capacity of daycares or dramatically increase the funding beyond what they've already promised. Now, the first option is unfair. We cannot prevent people from accessing childcare. And yet, what we're seeing is that it's predominantly middle and high income families who are getting access and low income families who are being left out. This is backed up by research from the Parliamentary Budget Office, which reported that the Liberals' plan is not sufficient to meet the demand for childcare. In fact, it will fall short in providing spaces for 182,000 children. Now, I said earlier we've lost 118,000 spaces since 2019, so this government is well on their way to meeting at least one of their goals, which is the reduction reduction of childcare spaces. They've reduced it by 118,000, and the parliamentary budget officer says it's going to go to 182,000 under these Liberal policies. And that is what we're already seeing in Alberta. Operators are struggling to stay open, they're closing down, they're reducing spaces, and it's lowering accessibility for families. Now, Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left? Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We cannot continue going down this road. We need a new way to move forward. We need to support all childcare operators, regardless of the model that they choose. We need to provide not only affordability for families, but accessibility for families, and we're not getting it under this failed NDP Liberal policies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.